that's better. So 4 presentations on energy. So me and my colleagues. So I joined the university in August, and I was happy to find that there's a very interesting group of researchers looking at energy issues in the UK, the issues of transforming energy systems in the context of climate change and energy security. The UK is particularly interesting because it's a highly liberalised, market-based energy system, so it faces particular challenges. So those issues occupy us in particular, and the similar types of challenges that face European countries as well. So every Wednesday we meet, we have a reading group, and we discuss issues around the UK and European energy systems and how insights from STS, innovation studies, and economic sociology as well can be brought to bear to help us to interrogate and unpack these challenges facing energy systems in this time of transformation. So the talk today, it's 4 separate perspectives really. It's not really one integrated message that we're trying to bring to you, but there are some common themes that we like to address. So I'll introduce those, and I'll provide some background in the context of the UK energy system and the challenges that it's facing. So just a bit of background to introduce us. Janet Webb is the PI on a project, Jan is over there, on heat, called Heat in the City, which is a very interesting approach, a socio-technical approach to the analysis of the transformation of heat systems in UK cities. Issues around how to develop district heating systems and how to reconfigure energy demand to make it more efficient. So that's UK Research Council's energy project, and Dave is the research fellow on that, and Mark Winskill, who spoke yesterday, is a co-I. And Mark talked yesterday about his work with the UK Energy Centre, which is very much plugged into the UK national energy policy kind of debate. And my own background is, as I said, I joined the university in August, so I'm a lecturer in STIS, and my disciplinary background is in engineering and sustainability. And I came up from Leeds, and when I was in Leeds I was working as a researcher on an EPSRC interdisciplinary consortium called Transition Pathways, and that was looking at interrogating future scenarios for the UK electricity system. So in my talk today I'll focus a bit more on the electricity system, and then Dave will talk about the heat sector. So we have different approaches and disciplinary backgrounds, but in our reading group we like to think about STS, innovation studies, and crossovers with economic sociology, because as I said, the UK energy system is a highly market-based energy system. And how is that being transformed? What are the new relationships between the state and the market that are happening in the context of energy system transformation? So we're attempting to find common ground, how to frame, understand, and analyse this energy system transformation, issues around climate change, energy security, fuel poverty, rising energy costs, and similar drivers. So as I said, there are 4 different perspectives, so we're not bringing one integrated whole, but we have some common themes that are kind of emerging from our discussions that we're interested in exploring together. So I think one is the relationship between infrastructure change, socio-technical change, and issues around energy, finance, and markets. So to make socio-technical studies a bit more sensitized to those kind of economic hard issues around finance and markets. And because we're really interested in the UK context, which as I said is a highly liberalised market-based system. So what is the past, present and future of liberalised energy markets in the UK? And how is that shaping the transformation of energy systems and the way we address issues around climate change and energy security? So thinking about those issues, a few months ago, back in March, we organised a workshop. So we invited some policymakers, some academics, economists, traditional economists, STIS researchers, policymakers, and other interested parties. So there was about 20 people or so around the table. And we were responding to this, I guess, the repoliticisation of energy that's happened in the last year or two. The tagline really was taken from this Ed Miliband speech, which was made to the Labour Party convention last year, where he really kind of set up energy markets as a real hot political issue. So as a key Labour Party policy coming into the election is around resetting the energy market. The energy market isn't working for UK customers, so how do we reform and reset the energy market? So that was the kind of the tagline and the title of our workshop. And we set out a task for the participants, to address that question to diagnose what are the problems with the energy market and what kind of solutions should we be thinking about. And we invited some very interesting people. We had some very conventional economists, neoclassical economists, and regulatory economists who were actually involved in the design of energy markets in the UK in the 80s and 90s. So the first quote is the title of one of the presentations from one of those people, and he was talking about liberalised UK energy markets in theory and practice, so drawing from his engagement with policy in the 80s and 90s in designing UK energy markets, and the return of the fatal conceit. So he's very critical of what's happening in UK energy policy at the moment in terms of the return of state planning, as he sees it, and very much more interventionist government policy. So some people are very critical of this kind of return of the state, whereas others had a different view. So the second perspective was from someone who was a bit more critical of the energy market. He sees low carbon generation, things like renewables. The markets don't work for these technologies that we need to address our long-term energy policy goals. So we need to fundamentally rethink energy markets to achieve these long-term objectives. So we found there was an interesting, the way that people talk about energy policy and energy markets today it's very interesting and highly politicized in many ways, in this kind of dichotomy between the state and the market. So I think in our research we're interested in exploring that relationship between the state and the market and trying to overcome this kind of polarized way that people talk about it. So exploring how the state, government and markets are becoming integrated and realigned in new ways. So the outline of the talk, so it's kind of divided into two bits. Myself and Dave will talk about more practical issues around electricity and heat markets. So those are kind of brief snapshots of our empirical work. I'll talk about electricity and Dave will talk about heat markets in UK cities. And then in the second half, Mark, who spoke yesterday as well, and Jan will reflect a bit more on the wider theoretical issues and reflections on that. So Mark will talk about a STIS perspective and what kind of insights STIS can bring to this. And then Jan, who's a sociologist, will talk about how the sociology of markets, the work of people like Donald Mackenzie and Michelle Callan can inform these types of debates. So I'll just provide a few slides on a bit of background, what's happening in the UK at the moment and the kind of challenges and dynamics that are taking place. So in the UK context, so this graph shows the electricity power generation plants on the UK system at the moment. So each dot is a power plant and it shows when it came onto the system. So it goes right back to the late 1960s when in the black we can see many of the coal-fired plants were constructed in the late 1960s over a very short period of time, so the late 1960s and early 1970s. So one of the key challenges that the UK is facing at the moment is that a lot of these old coal plants are shutting down in the next number of years. So this is one of the kind of key drivers around the energy security problem that the UK faces. What does it replace these old coal plants that came onto the system 40, 50 years ago with? And during the period of public ownership, when the UK electricity system was run by state companies, so we had these big investment programs in coal plants, in nuclear generation during the 70s and 80s. And then in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the UK system was privatized. So we saw the introduction of markets and private energy operators. And we had this very rapid, what's known as the dash for gas. So that's the green line, when there was a very rapid scale up of gas-fired generation in the UK over a very short period of time. So that's known as the dash for gas. And then in the early 2000s or so, the UK government started to put in place specific policies for renewables. So in the purple and blue line, we have this early stage acceleration of investment in wind, offshore and onshore wind power. So in the UK context and the kind of infrastructural kind of context is about moving from this coal and nuclear dominated system, which moved on to this dash for gas. And we're at this point of uncertainty about where the UK electricity system is going next. Will it be a new dash for gas? Will we see an accelerated investment in renewables? Will we see a new nuclear investment programme? So there's uncertainty around the kind of future pathways that the UK electricity and energy system is going to take in the future. So that's the kind of infrastructure, hard infrastructure context, but there's also an interesting kind of market and global supply chain context. So over the past 20, 30 years, the UK has become much more reliant on gas supply for its electricity and heat. And I think it was around 2003, 2004, there was a change because the UK switched from being an energy exporter to being an energy importer because of the reduced output of the North Sea oil and gas. So that kind of marked a turning point in UK energy policy from being an exporter to an importer, and has changed the UK's relationship with globalized energy markets. So currently in the right graph we can see that the UK currently gets its gas from two main sources. So one is pipelines from other European countries, so there's pipelines to Norway, Belgium and the Netherlands. And it also gets liquefied natural gas, so shipped in by tanker from mainly countries like Qatar. So the UK is now plugged into these wider European and global energy markets in a very interesting way, which creates new complexities for energy policy in the UK. And one of the areas that I'm quite interested in is how actors in the UK energy system are dealing with this new complexity and uncertainty. So I'll set up a couple of research questions that I'm interested in exploring around that. So this issue of the future direction of the UK energy infrastructure, how it's plugged in and interacts with these complex globalized and European energy markets, these are new sources of uncertainty and complexity for UK energy policy. So I've tried to characterize some of the kind of other factors that are influencing this new kind of complex picture and how they're interdependent in different ways. So I see it as kind of two feedback loops. So on the international side, there's questions, these are kind of uncertainties and questions that are feeding into this new complex picture. So what's happening with fossil fuel prices, issues around shale gas, the potential for supply shocks, things like Fukushima, how do they influence global fossil fuel prices? What are the dynamics of low carbon technology costs as renewables are increasingly deployed around the world? Are there costs being reduced, and what's the relative economics of low carbon investment versus fossil fuel investment? And what are the factors that influence that? So those are the kind of key international kind of uncertainties. And then when we think about the domestic context, there's uncertainties around government commitment to the climate change objectives. So the UK currently has targets of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So how committed is the UK government to achieving that target? What is the hierarchy of objectives of energy security and climate change and rising energy costs? What are the ideological commitments to markets? And another set of uncertainties around how customers and citizens are reacting to this new kind of energy context. What are the reactions to price rises? Are there new forms of democratic engagement happening around energy? So I see these as kind of interlinked kind of feedback loops that are feeding into this new kind of complex picture. I'm currently interested in how low carbon investment, so investment in new nuclear and renewables, so a large scale investment program in low carbon electricity between now and 2030, so a relatively rapid large scale investment program, is being forwarded as a solution or as a way of dealing with this uncertainty by certain actors. So key industry, government and civil society actors are kind of forwarding this agenda as a way of dealing with uncertainty and complexity. So this is a quote from the Committee on Climate Change, which is a regulatory body which advises government on its climate policy, which kind of characterises this low carbon investment as a kind of an insurance policy against these new risks and uncertainties. So if the UK doesn't invest in low carbon technologies, it will become increasingly dependent on imports. And this would follow even if there is, extraction of shale gas. So it's a way of dealing with energy security issues and climate change. So we see a coming together of energy security and climate change as the key kind of driver for energy policy. So there's a significant kind of lobby behind this idea of rapid, large-scale program in low-carbon technologies. And I'm interested in exploring the mechanisms by which government and industry actors are coming together to kind of make this happen. So it's these new alignments of government and market actors. So these are a couple of examples of government initiatives to try and what I call kind of create low carbon investment opportunities. How do you make technologies investable? And these large scale investment programs, how do you make them happen? So Infrastructure UK is one example of an interesting kind of institutional innovation coming out of the UK Treasury. So that was initiated in 2012, I think. So it's begun to develop national infrastructure plans, so have a more integrated macro perspective on UK infrastructure, to identify key projects and begin to prioritize them, to begin to interact with the investment community in new ways. So there's new kind of alignments of government and investment actors. And to put in place guarantee schemes for infrastructure projects, so get them off the ground, to use the government balance sheet to help make that happen. The other initiative is the Green Investment Bank, which is more active in actually investing in the projects. So this is a $3 billion initial capitalization, begun in 2012. Key areas are in offshore wind, energy efficiency and waste. Its remit is to operate on commercial terms, and its aim is to crowd in private sector capital. And one of its key aims is to establish low carbon technology as a recognizable and as a trusted type of investment, as an asset class, as in investment language. So to create a pipeline of investment and to create a bridge between project developers and the capital markets, the wider investment community. So these are interesting kind of realignments of government and the wider investment community. The other initiative is the electricity market reform as a way of kind of dealing with and managing risk around low carbon technologies. So one of the key challenges facing technologies like nuclear and renewables is that they have a different investment risk profile. So there's a very high upfront capital cost and a very low running cost because there's no fuel. So that means a lot of the risk is concentrated up front. Whereas in the case of gas plant, it's a lower initial capital cost, but the running costs are higher over the lifetime of the generating plant. So there's issues around these different risk profiles and how investors deal with that. So one of the ways government is trying to attract finance and channel finance into the sector is by introducing long-term contracts for these technologies. So they're kind of overriding this idea of energy markets as the way of giving price signals for investments. So we're seeing a kind of rethinking of energy markets and the role of energy markets in UK energy policy. So the kind of research questions I'm forming around this is this issue of uncertainty and complexity, and how key actors in the energy system or the energy regime are dealing with this uncertainty and trying to turn it into risk that can be managed. So this is a form of socio-technical innovation. And there's some interesting literature on uncertainty and economic decision making. So this is a quote from Beckert. He talks about how actors under conditions of uncertainty clearly find it difficult to identify preferences and rank them and make decisions. So how do actors come together to deal with complexity and uncertainty and close it down and turn it into something that can be calculated? So what kind of social devices, what kind of innovations and institutional changes are happening to make that realizable? And kind of relating to the wider issues in innovation studies, this seems to be a more managed regime-led kind of innovation process. So what are the prospects of this kind of more centralized, incumbent-led innovation process? So these are the kind of questions that I'm interested in exploring as part of my research. So that was more of an overview of the UK energy context, kind of issues in the electricity system. So we'll pass over to Dave now, who will talk a bit more about more localized issues with heat. I'll give you this mic. We'll take questions at the end, if that's okay.
Cheers. It's